Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about grief and loss, so advice from a therapist on how to deal with grief. This is definitely not a fun topic, but it's a really important one, especially if you are somebody who's in the thick of just mourning a loss of a loved one. Before we get started, I'm Jessica and I'm a licensed counselor and a private practice owner. My goal with this channel is to create a place where talking about mental health and therapy feel approachable and not scary, and where we can work together to reduce the stigma on these topics. I would love to connect with you, so if you are new here, feel free to subscribe if these kind of topics interest you, and definitely leave any comments or questions that you have. I would love to connect with you. Okay, so getting started with talking about grief and loss. These are things that I've learned from obviously reading a lot of books on the matter, taking trainings in graduate school, and then also just working with a lot of clients on grief and loss. This is one of my areas of specialization. So I have worked with a lot of individuals on grief, losing a parent, losing a child, losing a pet. And so these are just common truths that I've found in doing this work. Of course, and no experience is a one size fit all. So some of these things might apply to you, others might not. But I think that when we're in the middle of depression or grief, oftentimes we feel so alone. And it just feels like no one else has experienced what we are experiencing. But that's just not true. A lot of times, things about the human condition we are all experiencing together and we just don't know it, right? Also, I've grieved the loss of loved ones and I've experienced some, if not all, of these things. So we're all in this together, and I just want to bring up things that maybe you're going through so you don't feel alone, and also giving you some insights about just grief and loss so we have the knowledge to move through it. Okay, so the first thing you need to know about grief is that it is not linear. So you've probably heard about the 5 stages of grief, right? They are, I'm gonna look at my notes because I can't remember them off the top of my head. They are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. What you probably don't know is that the woman who came up with these 5 stages of grief, her name was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. When she was researching grief, the people she was actually speaking to were people who were dying of terminal illnesses. So people who had cancer or things like that and were going to die soon. She didn't do her research with people who had actually lost someone. So a lot of times these 5 stages of grief are applied to the experience of losing someone when was not her initial intent behind them. So sometimes because of that, we get caught in this misconception of, okay, grief is supposed to look like this: denial, anger, acceptance, and we're going through this linear process when we just know from more research being done and therapists and clinicians working with clients on grief that is just not the case, right? So in reality, grief is messy. It's not linear. So sometimes you might feel, after losing somebody, you might initially feel anger, then sadness or depression, then back to anger, then feel acceptance, then back to anger. And it's not like, okay, if I go through those 5 stages in a few months, I'm gonna feel better. Nope. Years down the line, after losing someone who's close to you, you can feel as though grief has hit you in the face again, and you're right back to what it felt like 2 days after losing them. Of course, you won't feel like that forever, but don't set yourself up to think, okay, I've moved through grief, I've hit the 5 stages, and now I should be better, right? Like, no, Christmas or a holiday might come up in 5 years and you miss that person immensely, and it feels like you're right back in the thick of your grief. The second thing to know about grief is that it's going to feel like almost everyone has moved on before you. So you're gonna get this sense like, okay, it's been a few weeks and people have stopped asking me about how I'm feeling, or stop asking me about the person I've lost. And so it's gonna feel like everyone around you has moved on and you're like, I'm still in the thick of this, right? Like, how has everyone moved on so quickly and I'm still feeling this way? Especially in American or the United States society, we are not taught to support grieving people appropriately. So a lot of times we will stop asking about it too soon. We will think like, oh, they should be living life normally, especially if you haven't gone through it. Sarah Silverman, the comedian, she said something about losing a parent. She said, there are people who have lost a parent and there are people who have no idea what's coming. So especially if you haven't gone through a significant loss of a parent or a grandparent, you're not really gonna know how to support people that are going through that, because we don't talk about this. We are not good at grieving in this society. So it'll feel like, okay, it's been a few weeks, they should be better, they should be back at work, they should be functioning well. And for a lot of people, that's just not the case. For the first year after losing somebody really significant in your life, you're probably not going to be functioning the way you were before you lost them. You still might be struggling to get out of bed. You might be struggling to stay focused at school or work, and that's completely normal, okay? Even if it feels like everyone around you has moved on, it's so normal for in that acute place, at least a year after losing somebody, you're still struggling. But during that time, when it feels like everyone around you has moved on, you're gonna feel like a burden sometimes. Like, oh, I wanna talk about this person that I lost, or I wanna talk about the fact that I'm not feeling good. And you're gonna wonder, like, is it okay for me to bring this up to friends or loved ones? And the answer is yes. If someone is a true friend, they are going to wanna be there for you. They might not know how to bring it up, or maybe they're like, oh, they seem like they're doing okay, I don't wanna bring it up and make them sad. So if you're like, hey, can I just share a memory about this person, or can I talk about how I'm feeling? A true friend is gonna be there for you. And what we know is connection, feeling connected to people, is so important, especially during the stages of grief and loss, right? Don't isolate yourself. Stay connected to the people who love you. The third thing to know about grief is that moving on actually isn't even really a thing, right? The last thing I spoke about was feeling like everyone around you has moved on before you, but moving on actually isn't a thing. I heard a beautiful thing said about grief once, and it was, our grief actually doesn't get smaller, we get bigger, right? We become a different person after we've gone through I dropped my paper. We become a different person after losing someone who's so significant in our life. And it doesn't necessarily mean we become a worse person or our life is worse. We just are forever changed. So we actually become bigger and more able to cope with the grief. The grief never gets smaller. We just learn to wrap ourselves around it. And actually an example of this is I was just working with a client today, actually. I was planning on filming this video, and then I met with them and they were talking about their own grief of losing a parent. And they said, like, I've been kind of going through this for 2 years, and I've been letting myself feel the things which has kind of kept me in this low level depression. So I want to learn how to merge my grief with happiness. And they said that might sound weird. And I was like, that doesn't sound weird at all. It actually gave me chills when they said it, because it's exactly what the process of grief should look like. We learn how to merge our life, because we have to keep living. The living have to keep living. So we have to learn how to merge our life and feeling happy with also honoring the person that we've lost and honoring our grief, whatever that looks like on any given day. The fourth thing to know about grief is that you'll probably feel guilty after you've lost someone significant to you. Guilt after death is just part of the human experience. And I'm gonna get kind of deep here into like psychological theories. But existential therapists like Irvine Yalom is one who's amazing. He talks about how one of the main concerns of the human experience is us trying to deny the fact that we will eventually die. We will all die. And so he talks about how grief can sometimes be an unconscious way that humans deny our own mortality. So it's kind of trying to convince ourselves that we have some control over life and death. Even though consciously we know, like, no, I couldn't have prevented this death. Sometimes we consciously know that. Other times it does feel controllable. Like, oh, if I just called them more often, if I had just stayed in town longer, this wouldn't have happened. But really, we don't have control over these things. This is just our mind's way of trying to pretend like we do. So the thing to remember about guilt is that it's normal, it's part of the human experience, but it's not going to bring the person back, and it's not going to make you feel better. The fifth thing to know about grief is that you shouldn't use avoidance, okay? Avoidance is one of the most common coping skills or defense mechanisms because it feels so good in the moment. I feel bad, so let me go do something to avoid feeling bad, and that feels good, right? Because I don't want to feel bad. So I'll either go distract myself with something or use substances or just try not to think about it. But just remember that everything you avoid will eventually catch up to you. So when going through grief, it's best to lean into the messiness, to the emotions that you feel. Of course, we can't break down everywhere, right? Like if you're at work, maybe you're like, I don't want to break down at work because if I break down, I feel like I won't be able to get back to my work, or I don't want people to feel bad for me, whatever the reason is. But then in that case, it's okay to schedule your grief. Like, oh, I'm feeling so bad today. I miss this person so much. When I get home tonight from work, I'm gonna let myself cry. I'm gonna let myself listen to sad music and watch sad movies or look at pictures of the person and really let myself feel it. And then move on when it's time to move on. Not move on from the person, but just like let myself feel all the emotions and then go back to my life, because again, I have to keep living. So you don't want to sit with depression for too long, but you need to let yourself feel the messiness of grief. So the thing to know about not avoiding is that with grief, there's no way around it. There's only through it. The sixth and final thing to know about grief is that we need rituals. So rituals are so important because for us, they kind of mark time, they help us honor the person that we've lost, and they help us just kind of wrap our mind around what's happened. So think about funerals and memorials. Of course, they're meant to honor the person, to talk about how much we loved them and cared about them, but they're not there. I mean, depending on your spiritual beliefs, they might be, right? But they're not physically there in the room. So those things are usually meant for us to maybe try to get some closure or to just wrap our mind around what's happened, right? If we don't have those rituals, sometimes it's hard for our brain to even accept what's happened. So another way of doing this is on the person's birthday or on the anniversary of their death, doing something to mark that day. So having a cupcake with a candle on their birthday, it's a great way to honor them. Or on the anniversary of their death, writing them a letter, visiting their grave. These are all rituals that help us move through the grief. Okay, so those were 6 things that I, as a therapist, think it's important for us to all know about grief and loss. Again, if this video was helpful for you, please subscribe, stick around, and also leave a comment. Feel free to talk about a person that you lost and what helped you move through that, or what was important for you, or you can ask me questions, anything you need, I'm here. So please just leave a comment and I will see you guys next time.